and welcome to the third video of the FabFilter series. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the FabFilter Pro-G, which is FabFilter's expander plugin. So without further ado, let's get started looking at some of the features. I highly recommend you look at the Pro C2 video to familiarize yourself with basic parameters such as threshold, ratio, range, attack, release, and so on. These things, once you learn what thresholds are, they don't really differ that much throughout any other plugins which have a threshold parameter. So make sure you have some basic understanding of what these parameters do. But I'll still give you like a basic rundown as I use them to process some drums. I'm going to play you some drums right now. This is the drum track I'm going to be processing. Let me just solo this and also remove or deactivate the plugin. Right, so this is just a basic, very natural sounding wonky hip-hop beat. And so I would like to preface this entire lesson with some words, some more theoretical concepts that will really help you understand whatever is happening, especially with these parameters here, which, though you only see 4 big knobs, they contribute probably the vast majority of creative possibilities that you can achieve with this plugin. And understanding these parameters and what they do will help you greatly in the future videos where we're going to cover things like the Pro L2, the Pro MB. Those plugins make use of these particular parameters in pretty extensive ways. So given how complicated they are, they're not really complicated, they're just difficult to wrap your head around if you're not familiar with these ideas. It would really help you to stick around for this video and just learn what these things do, so you can, in the future, you're not going to be intimidated by these double knobs and how you can adjust them in different ways to accentuate different parts of your mix. So I'd like to just begin by saying that this plugin, and in fact really any expander plugin, is very stupid. And it's stupid because computers generally and computer software is stupid, because things that you and I take for granted, like for instance if I told you to put a ball in a basket, a 2-year-old could do that without being explained how. Whereas a computer couldn't even begin to do that, because it needs to be given explicit instructions. What is a ball? How does it look like? What's a basket? What is the act of putting something into something else? And so on. So a computer without a long list of prior instructions has no idea what basic things are that you and I understand without even thinking about it. In much the same capacity, like a lot of the plugins that you're using and a lot of computer software, music software that you're using, is very stupid, and it doesn't understand basic things that you and I just implicitly take for granted. For instance, when you and I listen to these drums, you don't even have to be particularly musically informed or inclined to agree that, yeah, okay, you have some kick drums, you have some snare drums, you have some rim shots in there. Generally has a very wonky vibe. Probably, it's designed for some hip hop track that's at a slower tempo. A compressor or an expander in this case has absolutely no idea what any of those terms mean, and really doesn't care. And that's really why these things actually tend to be quite powerful. It's that expanders, compressors, and generally dynamics processing units of any kind that process dynamic range, they only understand one thing very well, and that's volume. A compressor or an expander can look at a signal and tell you with extreme accuracy what the volume is here, what the volume is here, and how they change over time. That's all it knows. That's all it understands. It's just just hard volume. So if you ever want to do something like, let's say I want to make these drums tighter, or I want to make the kick drum sound louder than the snare drum, or I want the snare drum to be more pronounced, or I want there to be less room ambience. Compressor has absolutely no clue what you're talking about. It only understands the language of volume and what you can do with volume. And all of these knobs, in some degree, deal with volume. So you need to, as a mixing engineer, you need to come up with clever ways of using volume and modifying volume and processing volume to achieve certain things like making drums tighter or making the room ambience more present or any of that sort of thing. So that's the whole. That's why sometimes it's very difficult to find the right approach to certain artistic things you want to do when you're making music in a computer, or with, compressors aren't just limited to computers, obviously, but you need to figure out a way of using a simple thing like modulating volume and processing volume and differences in peaks to achieve these kinds of human abstractions that you and I just normally, we can discuss and we can talk about it easily, but computers have no idea where to even start doing any of those things. So with that in mind, don't ever get upset at your compressor for not sounding the way you want it to. Remember that it's very stupid. It only understands one thing, and you need to speak to it in its language, or else it's just it's gonna ruin your audio. With that in mind, let's look at what these values do and how they affect audio. So expanders, much like compressors, they treat dynamic range. However, compressors compress dynamic range. They reduce the differences between loud volumes and quiet volumes. And, with correct use of a compressor, you can make things sound more quote unquote professional or glued together, or, some sounding more even, or, these kind of human abstractions. But all they're doing is just reducing differences in loud and quiet volumes. Likewise, or conversely, the expanders, or this particular expander, since we're talking about the Pro-G, it increases dynamic range. It expands dynamic range. The way it does that is through several different clever ways of increasing the differences between loud volumes and quiet volumes. That's all it does. You have to keep that in mind whenever you're using an expander, because all it does is it looks at your signal, it sees that there's differences in volume, and then it makes that the loud parts appear louder and the quiet parts appear quieter. A compressor does the opposite. It makes loud parts appear quieter and quiet parts appear louder. Now, how does an expander achieve this? Well, you instruct the expander, because it's very stupid. You have to tell the expander which volume level are you going to listen to, that anything below this volume level will be attenuated or brought down, and anything above this volume level will be left alone and not touched and left intact. This is what the threshold value does in the case of an expander. With a compressor, a threshold tells the compressor which volume level do you want me to start compressing, so here it's the opposite. It's which volume level is the threshold for me to actually let through sound, and anything falling under it doesn't get let through. Or if it does get let through, it's going to be much less than in the original signal. So just with that basic mechanism, you're able to actually accomplish an unbelievable number of things. For instance, this particular plugin, it's one of the strongest expanders ever made, in my opinion. It lets you achieve so many different things with such a simple UI, and despite it being very stupid, it's also, it gives you a lot of opportunities to communicate with it in the language that it understands. So we're going to cover those. We're going to cover what sidechaining does. We're going to cover what these things, all these parameters do. So let's actually start shaping our drums. And we're going to do the things that I said earlier. We're going to try to achieve these human characteristics, or rather human abstractions, and try to achieve those through the brute language of volume, and just through looking at differences in peaks and dynamic range. So let's play this again. Let's enable our expander. And close this expert mode. The expert mode, it doesn't just open a new UI, it actually affects the sound because all of these parameters become engaged, so keep it off if you don't want to use it. If you're just interested in, alright, so before I actually mention that, since as I said, and this is I guess a mantra that you're gonna have to live with when you do any kind of engineering or mastering or anything of the sort, since this expander is stupid, right? It doesn't understand anything at all other than volume. If you want it to understand volume in the exact same way that we understand volume when we listen to these drums, then you don't have to bother with anything else. You don't have to open the expert mode. You just have to look at these parameters and affect these parameters. What that means is that whatever is playing through your speakers when you solo the channel that you want to process, that's the exact same thing that the expander is going to hear. So there's not going to be a difference between what the expander hears and what we hear. And that's going to be pertinent later on when we start sidechaining. But right now, since we're not concerned with anything, related to sidechaining, what these drums that are playing here are the exact same drums that the compressor is hearing. So when we start reducing the threshold on these drums, we're going to hear a direct effect and observe it visually in this graph. And there's not going to be any surprises as to what is, why it's not expanding a certain way, because it's reacting to the exact same thing that we can hear. So when I increase my threshold, I'm tightening the gates, and I'm not letting all of the sound through. I'm letting only the loudest parts through. Again, you can do away with any concept of let's say, some snare being powerful in the mix, or you can do away with concepts of drums being, too far off left field, or there being too much reverb. Consider everything in one variable, namely amplitude and peaks. We can hear the fact, and the reason I'm emphasizing all of this is because that's going to become incredibly important to understanding what sidechaining is and how sidechaining works in the context of dynamic range processing, because it tends to get quite dry and difficult. It's hard to wrap your head around everything. So in order to save time, I'm just reiterating this one fact, so whenever I come back to it, it's not surprising or anything like that, right? So when we increase our threshold, only the loudest peaks, the peaks of the highest volume, are going to make it through. And the ones underneath that, the ones that fall below the threshold, are going to be reduced. They can be reduced all the way to nothing. And that's going to happen if you increase your ratio all the way to 100:1. And that's what's known as a gate. It becomes a gate. This is useful if you're processing vocals and there's background noise in the vocals. And you want no background noise in the recording. So you basically increase the ratio all the way. And that makes it so anything that doesn't reach the threshold gets completely cut out. So if we try that with the drums. That starts to make the drums sound a bit more choppy, right? And they're choppy because the volume is dropping as soon as something doesn't reach the threshold, which is usually these like little clicks and shakers and rim shots. When they don't reach the threshold, they get drowned out at a ratio of 100:1. So the ratio, just like on a compressor, it works in the opposite way as the ratio does on a compressor, namely that it anything that at a ratio of say 4:1, that a signal that doesn't reach a threshold by 1 decibel gets brought down by 4 decibels. So it stipulates the multiplying effect of gain reduction. So something that's really high, it's going to reduce the gain by a lot. However, it's not going to reduce it past the maximum range that you give with this knob here. This particular expander can bring the volume down to a range of 100 decibels. So even if you have like a gate set up where any sound that doesn't reach the threshold just gets completely brought down as far as it can go, it can only go so far as the range. So you can still have a ratio of 100:1, but have virtually no expansion whatsoever. It's because this range value is the same thing as a gate, as a gate's floor value. The floor is simply the bottom-most volume that the signal can reach. So if you want something more aggressive, if you want something that completely eliminates background noise or completely eliminates mic bleed, then you want to increase that range to a value where you're satisfied with how quiet it is during the actual expansion. So for these drums, I'm going to keep my ratio at something like 10. I want to get the loudest parts of the drums to appear loudest with respect to the quietest parts, which means I'm expanding my dynamic range. So what I'm going to do is just increase my threshold to a point where the kick and the snare are popping through comfortably, and then everything else is sitting underneath the threshold. So the kick and the snare are making it through and everything else is being drowned out. Now it sounds a bit weird and a bit choppy, but again, how do we instruct the compressor in terms of volume and how volume is treated to make these drums less choppy and more natural sounding? Well, that's up to the engineer to decide which process to take. Generally speaking, something that's choppy would demand higher release values because you want the volume when the gate or the expander when the signal drops below the expander's threshold, you want it to drop with a slightly more relaxed slope. If it drops immediately, which would be the case if you had a release of 0, you get very choppy results. So first what we want to do is we want to set our release to 0 on purpose because we want to set the sustain of the envelope. If you ever use the synthesizer, then you would know what a sustain knob is, or a sustain value. It's simply a sustain knob on an ADSR envelope keeps your sound going at the maximum volume that you set, and only after that volume or after the envelope is finished. For example, if you lift your finger off the key, then you get a release. Then the release portion of your of the envelope begins. So in this case, the sustain value is synonymous with the hold value here. The hold it tells the expander the amount of time it needs to hold the expander open. It needs to hold the gates, so to speak, open. And then after that amount of time, it's going to let go and then drop back to unity according to the release value that you set. So this is what we're going to do. I want to set the hold so it encapsulates majority of the body of the drums in the low end. I don't want the body of the drums to be cut out too early. And once I get it just at about the level where the body is pops through at the level that I want it, then I'm going to top it off with a bit of release to make it sound more natural and have them tail off naturally at the end of every hit. Okay. And then we're just going to increase release a little bit. And then since I want my drums to retain their snappiness, I'm going to reduce the attack to 0 and see how that sounds. If you have high attacks, you're going to get very soft drums. If you start to hear clicking, which tends to happen if you have an attack of 0 and a high ratio, enable the look ahead and then increase the look ahead just a bit until you get rid of that click, because what the look ahead does is it initiates the expander the amount of time here earlier or before the peak actually comes in. So it anticipates the peak and then it actually opens the gates of the expander before the actual peak of the drums come in. If you set it too high, you can get a bit too much of the preliminary signal before the drum hit to enter along with the drum. You want to do it just enough where you get rid of that initial click and then you're good to go. So that's approximately how I would do it. The knee value does the same thing as it would do on a compressor. It just changes how drastic the transition is between the area below the threshold and above the threshold. Increasing this value would make your expansion sound more transparent. And again, if you want to include those drums that are being left out, but to a lower degree, then you need to reduce your ratio. So I think we've obtained our goal of removing some of the background noise and some of the room ambience, and we made the drums a lot tighter than they are, or than how they began. So in order to A/B and in order to see quickly between two versions of your patch, then you can press copy, and then A/B to go over to the new version. Or to an old version of the sound, so you can A/B between them quickly. I'm not going to copy, I'm just going to click B and then put my ratio down to 1:1, which means that there's no expansion. So anything that comes in, it's exactly as it came in, and we're going to see the difference. So you can hear that the bass drum is very beefy and huge. And we tailored it a little bit. We brought it in a little bit, brought the tail in a little bit, so it's not as, it doesn't occupy as much headroom. There's a lot of reverb, and the drums generally feel very loose. Whereas when we applied our expansion, we expanded dynamic range, we made the quiet parts sound quieter, and the result is a lot tighter, drier drums. Okay, so now let's begin looking at some of these parameters here. So as I said earlier, and I repeat it ad nauseum at this point, but it's nevertheless important. Pro-G doesn't understand anything other than volume. But what it can do is it can understand volume in different ways. So it still only looks at volume, but you can change what it hears in certain ways that it still only hears volume, and it only sees and understands differences in volume, But what if you tell it to listen to something different than what we're hearing and trick it into applying expansion to a signal that is different than the actual signal that we hear through our audio channel, so that it still applies expansion according to a volume gain trace, but that gain trace will be provided to the expander by a signal that's modified in some way. That would allow us to trick the expander into, for example, isolating a certain element in a track. For example, what if I only want to isolate the snare drum? In this particular drum track, I only want to apply expansion and dynamics processing to the snare drum. But how would this plugin know what a snare drum is? It would have no idea. It's simply too complicated to process and to figure out exactly what snare drums are, where they sit in the mix, and so on. Whereas we just right away we can hear the snare drum immediately. This plugin and these kinds of plugins need to be told explicitly where these snare drums are. So then they can look at a specific part of the frequency band, which is what we're going to do to trick the expander into thinking that it's only listening to a snare. And then we're going to filter out the part of the frequency range where the snare is. And then the resulting filtered signal will have its own volume trace. The difference is that volume trace, if we filter out the kick drum, will only contain the snare drum, right? And maybe some other elements, but generally it'll only contain the snare drum, and therefore the expansion will be triggered by a signal that has snare drum volume, okay? So what that means, the end result of that would be a track, or a track, in this case a drum track, where expansion is being applied to everything else that's not as loud as the snare, because we're going to make everything quieter than the snare by filtering. And if everything is quieter than the snare, and we set the threshold so that everything below the level of the newly filtered snare doesn't reach the threshold, but the snare will actually pass the threshold, then we can theoretically isolate only the snare. So let's try doing that, and we're going to do this with sidechain in. And the reason why I went on about this idea of us being able to hear exactly what the compressor hears, or the expander, now we are going to hear something else. We're going to still hear this signal that we started with, but the compressor is going to hear this signal with a filter on it. And it's going to hear the same signal because we're using we're sidechaining the same thing. It's using its own sidechain input. Whereas if we used an external signal, we can send a totally different signal from a different channel to this plugin, and it's going to start applying expansion to that signal. But the actual expansion effect will be applied to the same track that we've been working on this entire time. That's called sidechaining. Except in this case, we can actually sidechain things to themselves, because the signal that we're using to expand isn't the exact same as these drums. Otherwise, there would be absolutely no point of sidechaining. You would just use the expander as we did in the first half of the video. So let's start isolating the snare, and we're going to use this audition button religiously to hear exactly what the compressor hears. Let's have a look here. So I'm going to increase the low pass. I don't want to get the kick. And this volume you see over here at the threshold, that volume, that is the exact same thing as what the compressor is seeing without this audition being on. So what you're hearing is being shown on this volume, on this threshold knob. So you're going to be adjusting your threshold based on what you see in the screen, and also what you see as averaging out on this knob. So we want to filter out just the snare, or get as close as possible. And observe what's happening in this screen here, and watch the graph. So if we start at the beginning, the kick and the snare are coming through at the same volume, and that's useless to us because if I set a threshold now, there isn't a single threshold out of any choice of thresholds that's going to filter only the kick and not the snare, and vice versa, because they're both hitting at the same volume. However, if I filter the kick out, now I can get the threshold to sit above the kick because most of the kick is gone, but below the snare. So the snare now has a higher volume than the kick. So even though we're affecting frequencies and we're using a bandpass filter on a frequency band, we're still thinking of everything in terms of volume, because at the end of the day, the expander only understands volume. So it sees the volume trace as different. But we're not going to hear this, right? We're auditioning the sidechain input right now. We're not going to hear this ugly filtered version. We're just tricking the compressor to think that this is what we want it to hear, and it's going to filter out the right things for us because we told it what to do. And as you can see, the snare is becoming very isolated on the graph. There it is. So even though this sounds nothing like a snare, this auditioned signal, the volume trace that we have represents the snare in time, right? So that's satisfactory for our purposes. We want to make sure that the expander will be triggered by some part of the signal that most closely resembles a snare, because that's what we want it to do. So let's turn off the audition now and listen to what happens. Pretty good. We're going to intensify the effect by increasing the ratio and the range, but observe what happens again in the graph, and look at where the kick sits. And look at what the change is between the natural signal, which is dark. It's like the shadow behind the graph, and the light graph in front of it. The snare sits happily above the kick now. We made it sit above the kick. And so now what we can do is increase the ratio. So even though the compressor only hears this, it's enough for it to, for our purposes of instructing it where the snare drum is in this plethora of different peaks and volumes that it can only see, right? So now we're going to change these parameters and try to get the snare to sound more natural. Cool. So we've successfully managed to isolate a snare from an entire drum track, which a computer would never do on its own, but just by using a few knobs and by cleverly instructing it to look for certain volumes and certain peaks in different ways, then we've managed to isolate a drum out of a complex track of with many other drums, right? But that's not the only way that this expander can understand volume. We can modify the sidechain signal in other ways to confer onto the expander the signal that we're working on, but with other interpretations of volume. So in this interpretation of volume, we're filtering, and the resulting gain trace allowed us to expand according to a specific band pass, right? Or to a specific frequency band. However, these knobs over here, if we use the left-right channel mode, they allow us to change the volumes of the left and right channels. Now, according to the theory that we've been discussing up to this point, what would happen if I made the left channel loud but the right channel quiet? Well, the gate or the expander would be triggered more often by the left channel because it has louder volumes. The right channel won't be triggered as often because it has a quieter volume. That's the basic explanation. Unless we set the threshold low, in which case, even though we adjust this volume to be low, both volumes are passing the threshold and therefore you won't hear a difference. But if you want to expand your signal and have an emphasis on one particular element in the left or the right channel, then you need to enable this channel mode and change these knobs, or the big knobs in the middle over here. When you modify these, the basic gist of what's happening to your audio is that the sidechain input is basically split into two. There's two expanders. These are just two independent expanders. They begin as being stereo linked. So they both, the left knob here represents what you hear in your left headphone, and the right knob here represents what you hear in your right headphone. And you can change their gains. It's kind of like a panning knob on a single track, but this is effectively two tracks. The cool thing is that this particular ring outside of this knob allows you to, these are dry wet knobs. So these are, the middle ones are gain knobs and the outer rings are dry wet knobs. And they allow you to change in this particular left-right mode. And if you're using the stereo version of Pro-G, they allow you to change the source of where the sound is coming from before it enters this gain stage. So for instance, this is going to be represented by my left headphone, but if I turn this outer knob to all the way to the right, that means that it's the right side of the stereo field of these drums that is being fed through the left headphone. Likewise, if I do this inwards, that means the right headphone is going to be playing the left stereo field of the sidechained input signal. That effectively means that you're just inverting your stereo field in this case. So if we click Audition and play what we have, and if you want to change both of these rings simultaneously, hold Alt, and you can invert them to where they stand naturally. And that's just an inversion. So you have that opportunity. You have the opportunity to rearrange how the stereo field of your actual sidechain input signal. Because all that's going to play a role in how your volume gain trace is going to be shown. So let's just keep this as it is currently. We turn these outer knobs all the way to the left and right. So now this is a stereo linked. These are the left and right channels that represent our sidechain input signal exactly. Whereas if we press Alt and bring our dry wets to the middle, that means that the left and the right headphones are playing the same signal that's coming from the middle. That means it's going to sound like a mono signal to us when we audition it. Now you might be wondering why the hell this matters and who cares about panning. Well, it's just an extra layer of control that you have. Let's say I want to, as I mentioned earlier, to make one of the channels louder than the other. That will have, that doesn't just mean in the case of expansion, right? Because right now we're crafting the signal that the expander can hear and that the expander will then use to affect the sound that we can hear. So it's in our interest to take some time and maybe accentuate some elements in one side of the stereo field versus another side. Just like we were accentuating elements of a frequency band, we can also accentuate elements of the stereo field. So I'm going to reduce the sidechain level of the left channel, and that means the right channel will be predominant, and we have audition mode on. So let's hear what the expander is going to hear. So the left channel is virtually inaudible. So that means that the first thing that's going to trigger the expander will be considering that the left sidechain level is minus 20 decibels currently. If we have our threshold anywhere above minus 20, we're only going to hear the right side of the stereo field, because these things are gain knobs that actually make it out into our audio channel in Ableton. So let's see if that's true. Okay, so now we're still expanding our signal because we still have a threshold, and there's still signal that doesn't meet the threshold. We can hear it in the auditioning mode again. But for some reason, well, for a reason that we understand now, we're only hearing the left side, and that's because we're only hearing the right side of the stereo field because we reduced the level of the left side. But it's still there, it's just quieter. That means that if we reduce our threshold to find those peaks, we're going to get a predominance of the right channel, but then when the left channel is loud enough to break the threshold, we're going to get the entire signal then, because in those moments, the entire signal will be there. So that's pretty cool, right? Because you can now hear in the right side, you get that clicking and clacking, but all together, the kicks and the snares are coming through loud and clear, despite the audition signal sounding completely lopsided to one side. And this might be a bit difficult to comprehend at first, because these are just different and they sound different, and how the hell is this going on? Well, if you understand everything in terms of volume, then it starts to make sense. All this expander is doing, it's reacting to the volume that's coming from the sidechain input. We made the volume on the right side louder than the volume on the left side. That means that the gain trace that is being created by the sidechain reacts to the right side louder more often than the left side. But that doesn't mean that it's always going to do that. If we reduce the threshold to the point where the left side just starts peeking through, and you can notice that it's only the loudest elements that are peeking through, right? It's the kicks and the snares, not everything else. Our threshold isn't low enough to get everything else. In fact, if it was low enough, there would be no difference. Have a listen. This is still the same signal. It has a right side gain of 0 and left side gain of minus 20. It's just the threshold is low enough that both the minus 20 and the 0 are sitting above it, and there's no gating. And there's one more mode here which does the same thing, just the same exact. You're going to use the same mechanisms. It's even more confusing because the audition mode is a little odd. But instead of separating the sidechain input into left and right, it's going to separate it into mid and side. If you ever use the mastering plugin, mixing plugin, you know what mid and side is. The mid is generally talks about what sounds mono in your stereo signal, and the side is just what is the difference between the full stereo signal and what's mono. So this is going to be all the elements on the far kind of stereo field of your mix. And so when you have audition off, right, these inner knobs control the gains of the mid and the side. So the left knob controls mid, and the right knob controls side. However, you'll notice that when you click audition, you'll notice that the left knob controls gain of the mid, but you can hear it on only your left headphone, and you can only hear the side on your right headphone. And what's the deal with that? For instance, if I do this, and the outer ring, I turn it all the way to the right so that I get 100% side signal. So I'm not hearing my kick drum, right? Because the kick drum is purely mid. All of those little side tambourines are all stereo elements. But why am I only hearing this on the right side, on the right headphone? And that's because the FabFilter have decided that in order to ease ease monitoring and for you to quickly make decisions and not have to confuse yourself with like setting up mid and side monitoring on the same set of headphones, the right side is hardwired to represent the side signal, and the left headphone represents the mid signal. But that's not to say that the side signal will be only shown on the right headphone when you are actually turn off audition mode and start working here with the threshold. Because it's just for you to listen on your right headphone and say, okay, I can hear just the general trace of the volume. Let me adjust my threshold. So it's purely it was a design decision by FabFilter. So don't think that these are still left and right knobs, because they're not. Likewise, this is showing the mid signal. And another confusing thing, you might be wondering why, since this is mid, I understand that it's mid and that you're hearing it on the left headphone because that was just a design decision, so you can monitor it easier. But why is there a mid and side parameter, a dry-wet parameter, for a signal that is supposed to be just the mid, right? Let's see what happens. And again, the answer is think about everything in terms of volume. Right now, you're thinking of things in terms of mid and side, and whether mid could be in the side and whether the side can be in the mid. That is not what this compressor understands. It has no idea how mid and side factor into the sound of the track. That's up to you to decide, right? All it hears is volume. So all you're doing while you're instructing this plugin to do is you're saying, okay, take the side component of the sidechain signal that I'm giving you, which is these exact drums, since we pressed the in button. Take the side component and just make it mid. You're not going to hear it being mid. You're just going to see it being mid, and the expander is going to understand it as the volume trace. It's not going to concern itself with whether or not it's weird to put a side signal straight down the middle. It's only going to look at the volume trace and say, okay, I see this volume trace that you made that is responding to the side signal, and you want that to be the same volume trace that affects the mid of your actual track. So I'll do that. So let's actually try that. So I want the side component of my drums to be the actual mid, or rather, I want the volume trace that's reacting to the side component of my drums to be representative of the mid of the stereo field in the actual track. And I understand this is incredibly confusing. I'm really sorry if it is, but I'll just explain as we go. So right now, it's on your left headphone for some reason. Turn off the audition mode and let's listen to the product. So notice how you can only now hear mono. You're not hearing any stereo info, right? And now once we increase the level, now more of it is passing over the threshold. So why is it that this is set all the way to stereo, but it's passing through and sounds mono? And the reason is because, again, it doesn't matter why it's a stereo and why it's passing through as mono. All that matters is that mono and stereo will just have different volume curves. That's it. And the expander is just following the volume curve. So if you look at the audition, imagine that what's on your left headphone now is just down the middle. And follow the volume curve. The snare in this volume curve is very loud because that's the only thing that's present in the stereo field. the hi-hats are there. So those things are going to be part of your volume curve. Now take that volume curve and only put it to expand your middle of your stereo field, and that's what that allows you to do. Now, that's obviously a pretty esoteric use, but you can do it. Let's turn our dry wet all the way to the left. So now our mid is being represented by the mid of the sidechain input. So now let's play this. It's going to sound slightly different, and don't be upset that you can't hear the difference, because again, it's really hard to discern what's in the stereo and what's in the middle just by the volume trace alone. So, okay, so our dry wet for our mid, our mid channel is playing the mid of our signal, the mid of the input signal. However, there's no sidechain channel yet. Well, there is, it's just too quiet for our threshold. Let's raise up the side component. And the same thing applies. Right now, my side component is playing the mid, right? So what's being fed into this this channel right here as the mid of the signal is being put, is going to be spread out over my side. I don't want that. I want it to represent faithfully the sidechain input. So the side elements will be the exact same. The gain trace will follow the side elements just as they do in the sidechain input as they do on the actual track we're hearing. So now we're going to increase the gain. Right now we can only hear the mid section because our mid is 0 or 1 decibel. Our side is -22, and that will start to matter once we bring down the threshold. And think about it the exact same way. The mid is overpowering the side, right? So therefore, most of the time we're going to be hearing mid, but now we can make it so that certain elements of the dynamic range, namely the loudest parts, because we're not filtering, it's going to be the kick and the snare. The kick and the snare are going to pop through in stereo. Everything else is going to pop through in mono. That's how we set, according to these parameters, that's what we can predict. And let's see if that's true. There we go. So the snare is a bit in the stereo field, right? In the stereo field, the snare is louder than the kick. The kick does not exist in the stereo field because it's straight down the middle. So when we tell the stereo component of this input signal to represent the actual side gain knob, we're telling the compressor, look, there's no kick there because the kick is just not part of the sidechain input stereo component. So you're not going to be amplifying it. So that's why we're only hearing the snare expand in stereo, because when we play this, I mean, I don't even want to use the audition mode because it puts the middle on the right and the side on the left. But the side signal only has the snare in it, right? If we turn this down, the snare figures much more clearly than the kick. So this allows you to do real stereo expansion without using reverb, without using delays, without using unison expansion, or unison detuning. This is the real deal. This is how it's done. You're just instructing the expander to listen to volume in different ways. That's all you're doing. Let's try to do the same thing, but in the opposite way, where we're going to have the stereo field overpower the mid component. And so you're going to hear mid most of the time, or stereo most of the time. And then the kicks will probably be the loudest, right? Because they dominate the mid more than any other element. So how would we do this? Well, okay. We want our mid to represent our mid, that's fine. But we want our mid to be quieter. We want our stereo to overpower the mid, and then we want to reduce the threshold so that the stereo is sitting comfortably above it, but the mid just starts peeking through. And let's see how that's going to sound. So right now we're only hearing stereo. The kick is panned slightly to the right, to the left, if you can hear that. That's because it's panned slightly to the left in the original input signal. But at some point we're going to reach this -15, or we're going to reach the point at which the mid will start shining. Oh my goodness, I'm in audition mode. I was thinking, I'm listening and listening, I can only hear my left headphone increase in volume. Okay, don't fall for this trap. As soon as you understand why audition mode sounds as odd as it does, forget about it and adjust the size accordingly. So now we're going to reduce our mid, increase our stereo. So we're only going to hear stereo at first. Oops, let's reduce that even more. We can only hear this weird hollow stereo component. But once we start reducing the threshold more, we're going to get the kick in there. So we've done the opposite now. We have the kick and the snare. They're playing in mono, right? They're carrying the mix, but all the other elements are playing on the side. If you don't like the degree to which they're sitting in the sides, then you can reduce this wet knob and direct them more towards the center. And also reduce their volume, reduce the volume of the actual sidechain level. And finally, what you could also do is you can manually adjust, or rather, you can instruct the filter. You can instruct the expander to listen to all of this, but also filtered. So let's say I want to keep this weird, I like the other one more where we had the, I think it was like this. No, sorry. We had it like this. Yeah, we had the snares and the high elements were in stereo. So now the high end and the snares and stuff, they're all screaming out in stereo only when they're hit. We can change how that works. I'm not even going to click audition, since now we understand what the signal is actually doing. If we narrow the frequency band, right, and we filter out the kick, that means that the kick will be very quiet in both channels, in both the mid and the side components. So the kick basically will be non-existent. So if we only sidechain it to the high end, what are we going to expect? We're going to expect the high end to be the loudest in both the mid and the stereo components, probably. And then what's going to happen is only if we reduce it far enough will we get any kick, but generally we can filter out the kick altogether, and we're going to have the same stereo effects happening with the side being very sparse and the mid generally dominating the mix. the kick is still popping through. Let's try to get this right. I need to reduce probably... Actually, let's try this. So that's a really cool effect, right? The kick is being filtered out. The snare is being triggered. The stereo elements are remaining. And you get this cool otherworldly sort of effect. So you can use this as a layer or something like that, right? Anyways, sorry if that was a long-winded video, but we're going to take all these concepts, we're going to put them into the next videos, so you're not going to have to worry about figuring these things out, because these the notion of stereo linking and there being independent compressors and expanders that operate independently, it's a pretty weird concept, especially when you have this weird monitoring setup where when you audition and the mid is played on the left and the side is played on the right, it's really confusing sometimes. But I hope you took something from this video, and I hope you can go and employ this unit in your own productions and your mixes. All right, thank you very much.